So today, I have to make petticoats. It's one of my least favourite jobs. It's so repetitive and it's a kind of a necessary evil. Unfortunately, I can't use the one I made for little Dorrit because that was a bodiced petticoat and it's that empire waist style, so I have to do it all over again. But with the corset finished, I'm so close to moving on to the bits I'm excited about, so I'm just gonna bash out some really simple petticoats. I'm just gonna make it as easy as I can on myself. We're not gonna do any ruffles, probably not gonna do any tucks. They're just gonna be rectangles gathered onto a waistband. I have also asked for recommendations in a Facebook group I'm a part of about reducing weight and bulk, because that was one of the things I really struggled with my little Dorrit costume, was just the weight of it. It made me feel like I was wading through treacle the whole time. Something that they unanimously suggested was to make the petticoats out of organdie. So I have bought myself some organdie and it is literally, it's like paper. So I'm going to make two petticoats. I'm going to make an organdie petticoat, which is sort of going to be my structural layer, and I might put a ruffle on the bottom of that one to help with the shape. Maybe not. Who knows if that's necessary. It might not ruffle down nicely either, so I might have to pleat it onto a waistband. It might not gather down, that's what I mean, sorry. So I reckon I'll have to pleat that onto a waistband. And then what I've done for sort of my ordinary cotton petticoat, I've bought, oh, I should probably pre-wash this. But what I've done is I've bought extra wide cotton sheeting, so I can hopefully just cut a length, sew it into a tube and gather it down, and we'll have a petticoat. And maybe if I'm feeling fancy, I might put some tucks at the bottom or some lace or something. But I'm making this as easy as possible on myself because I'm running out of time, I'm running out of energy, and I'm running out of enthusiasm for this project right now. I have to be honest. If I don't start working with my nice silk soon, I think I might cry. I started by measuring approximately how long I wanted my petticoats to be. I knew I didn't want them to be to the floor, and doing this on yourself is difficult, so I mostly just guessed. I then measured the width of the organdie to see how many panels I would need. I decided that 3 would be enough to get the volume I wanted, and then I measured out that length I just measured on myself and tore the organdie into 3 panels roughly that long. I then changed my machine needle because this organdie is very delicate and the needle was starting to get a bit blunt from sewing through all the layers of the corset I'd just made. And then I sewed all those organdie panels into a tube. I left an opening in one seam to act as a placket so I could get the petticoat on, but mostly I just bashed these straight seams through the machine as fast as possible. I then noticed one of my panels was a lot longer than one of the others. I must have not been paying attention when I measured it, so I just ripped a bit off. I'll probably just crease it with my fingers, can't I? I mean, we'll give it a press anyway for good measure, but... I pressed the seams open and then began hemming the petticoat. The crisp, papery nature of the organdie definitely made this process easier. I folded it up once and pressed it in place all the way around, and then folded and pressed it again. This is my preferred way to do this, especially for deeper hems like this. The deeper hem would help the bottom edge of the petticoat stand out and create more volume. And then I just machined the hem in place. I lined everything up nicely so that the top stitching wasn't too ugly, but yeah, I again just bashed it through the machine. I then had a bit of a disaster. This papery fabric tore so easily that when I went to fold back the seam allowance of the placket section, it just tore right along the selvage. So I did a very basic mend with a zigzag stitch on the machine, just butting the 2 torn edges up against each other and zigzagging along the tear. Not at all pretty or even that strong, but it worked. Then I made a waistband. For this, I used waistband Petersham and I just wrapped a bit around my waist with a generous amount of overlap, once a theatre costumer, always a theatre costumer, and cut it to length. I then set up that length of Petersham to become a waistband. I started by neatening the raw edges by folding them under and zigzagging them in place. Then I found the centre of the waistband by folding it in half, made a crease at that point and stitched a line to act as a centre mark. I then measured half of my waist measurement with my corset on, away from that centre line. I'm using the markings on the front of my sewing machine here to do this quickly. Again, creased that point in place and marked it with stitching. I then matched those two lines of stitching up to find the midpoint between them, creased and stitched that. What I've done here is easily quarter my waistband, taking into account the overlap, no maths needed. I then transferred those marks to the other half of the waistband, again with the creasing and stitching, and this will make pleating this petticoat so much easier. This also works great for gathering and is absolutely the most efficient way to make any kind of period skirt, and I should know because I've probably made hundreds of these things in my lifetime. I then marked the centre front and the quarter points of the petticoat, this time using pins, and then started pleating the organdie onto the waistband by matching the centre front points. I'm not covering the petersham in anything because that will add bulk, which I don't want. I'm just going to sew the organdie directly onto the petersham. This is completely historically accurate. We even see this technique on outerwear skirts too. I kept a 3-inch section at the centre front flat without any pleats. This is the fashion for skirts generally in the 1840s because you have that long point of the bodice in that area, so you don't need any volume. I then matched the quarter. God, I'd forgotten that wrestling with this stiff fabric was a nightmare. But anyway, I matched the quarter points, and then that tells me how much fabric I have to pleat into the front quarter of the waistband. I then spent a really long time pinning the pleats into position. This took several attempts because I didn't measure anything or do any maths, I just eyeballed it. I knew I wanted the pleats to be roughly 1 inch wide, and I used my gridded cutting mat as a guide, but I didn't know how many pleats I needed or how much fabric I'd have to lose in each one. I just moved them about until it worked roughly and had an uneven pleat with whatever fabric I had left at the side. I then spent a very long time machining these pleats in place with a zigzag stitch. I'm going over the raw edge here so that I'm getting a really flat join and also stopping the organdie from fraying. I went really slowly to make sure nothing slipped or got tucked up in a weird way, and it was probably the most careful I was on this project. And then once those pleats were sewn, we had our first petticoat. I was thrilled with how light and yet rigid it was. On to the next one. So the same thing again, tearing off a length that matched my measurements and sewing it into a tube with an opening at the top. For the hem this time, I didn't even do any measuring or pressing, I just rolled it as I went. And then I gathered it down onto a waistband and zigzagged in place, only this time I used cotton tape instead of petersham, and well, it wasn't as successful. So I have a problem. The Organdie petticoat worked fine, looks great. I'm just waiting to put a hook and eye on the waistband until I try on my corset and the whole shaboodle. The other, cotton sheeting one, hasn't been so successful. I just did what I did before, but instead of using petersham, I used cotton tape, and the plan was I was going to just tie it. However, there is so much volume in this skirt that it doesn't gather down densely enough to reach my waist measurement. And also, as soon as I went to put it on, all the gathers ripped out because the cotton tape stretches and the gathering stitches didn't. So this was a fail. It's also still really quite heavy, and I don't know, I'd really kind of dreamed of having a lovely big fluffy petticoat, and I'm just not sure whether that's going to be a reality for me that can happen just with the weight of it. And there's no ruffles, there's no starch or anything. It's also too long. I mean, 180 inches is massive for a petticoat of this era. It's massive for a petticoat of anything that isn't like 1860s. But part of the reason I wanted to make it so big was so that I could use it across eras. That's what we do here. But I don't know what to do basically. I don't have any more plain white fabric to play with. So I either have to take this apart and cut it up and have less volume, or I really don't want to cartridge pleat it, but that might be the best option. Should I leave this one for now and just order new fabric, lighter fabric, voile or something to make a fluffy petticoat? That means I can't do anything today and I'm running out of time. I don't know what to do. I've had a brainwave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hem this to be considerably shorter than I need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a really wide shaped, almost yoke for the top of the skirt so that it sits snugly over the hips, and then the bottom edge should be bigger and then the fabric should gather down at that point, because I don't really want the excess volume. Oh no, I do, for that bell shape. Oh shit. But I suppose the bodice is quite long. Maybe if I make it with a point at the front? I have some experimenting to do. So I started version 2 by ripping off that failed cotton tape waistband and re-hemming the petticoat in exactly the same way as the organdie one. I didn't unpick my previous hem, I just left that as a double fold. It was a bit bulky, but oh well. When I machined it in place, I deliberately used a tacking stitch because I knew this was a bit of a guess and I might have to lengthen or shorten the hem later. I then got all corseted up to create the pieces for the yoke. The plan was to just drape this directly on my body, and I was using offcuts from my bloomers before I realised I should probably wear my organdie petticoat too. I roughly pinned the bits of cotton in place, there's a back piece going on here too, and then pinned in the shape of the yoke I wanted. I wanted it to be very narrow at the side, but follow the lines of the corset at the front. I only pinned in one half, so I simply folded the fabric in half, chalked on the pin line, and then, adding seam allowance as I went, cut through both layers of fabric. For the back, I drafted a very quick and dirty curved waistband in a similar way, pinned the whole thing together and tried it back on. It was much too big, so I brought it in at the seams and pinched out a chunk at the centre back that would act as the opening and the underlap. I then started the process of turning those rough bits of fabric into the final pattern pieces. This involved trimming down the centre back for the opening and cutting a matching lining, chalking on all the sewing lines and notches, and then pinning the backs to the fronts at the side seam for main and lining before sewing those pieces together. Then with right sides together, I matched the side seams of main and lining up and began pinning the two together along the top edge. This then gets stitched in place, starting with the short end of the waistband that will form the underlap at the back. I reversed as I got to the corner for strength, and I rounded off the point slightly so that it's easier to get a sharp corner when I turn it right sides out. I then pivoted and reversed again before sewing along the sewing line I chalked in along the top edge. When I got to the other end of the waistband, it was the same thing again, reversing, pivoting and reinforcing the corner before stitching the short end. Once sewn, I notched the curved sections at the back to reduce bulk once I turned the yoke right sides out. I could then start pressing the seam along the top of the yoke into position. I started by pressing the seam allowances towards the lining over my tailor's ham to get right into that curved section. I could then fold the waistband in half crisply along the seam and press it flat. I did a little fussing with the corners to get them really sharp and made sure the seam allowances were lying nice and flat in there. I then sewed long gathering stitches into just the back sections of the petticoat. I knew I wanted to pleat the front instead. I was quickly running out of white thread at this point, so I used whatever colours I had lying around. I then gathered the back sections down and pinned and machined them to one layer of the yoke, waistband, whatever I'm calling it, starting at the side seam and finishing at the centre back, leaving the very end clear for the overlapping section. I left the gathering stitches in place for now, tying off the threads to keep the tension in place. I then pleated down the front, clipped it in place and basted over the pleats. I'm not attaching them to the yoke here, I'd just already sewn the yoke onto the back panels, and it actually would have been a lot easier to do the front first, but I didn't think of that, so now I had to wrestle this through the machine. In the end, I had to cut the yoke off again because doing the back before the front turned out to be a huge mistake. There was so much fabric to get into such a small space, I ended up using a pleating pattern more common in the 1850s and 60s of doing double box pleats. Again, I did this very roughly by eye. I made the top visible layer nice and even and then just hid whatever fabric I had left in the pleats that wouldn't be seen. Then I went upstairs to my sit-down, big ironing board to set up to press the pleats into position so I could reattach the yoke. This took a lot of fussing to get them smooth, and I haven't used this iron in so long that it took me a really long time to remember how to get it to steam, and then it spewed chalk all over my fabric. It was okay, everything survived. I then pressed the pleats in place really firmly. I wanted them to be really crisp, and it was at this moment I realised I should have brought my clapper up. But what I did instead was just let the pleats cool and then tacked them in place with long diagonal stitches and then repeat for all the other pleats. I then pressed under the seam allowance on my yoke, easing the curves in place and shrinking any excess with the steam. I then had to add the yoke from the right side, so this folded under edge was matched to the sewing line on top of the gathered sections and then carefully pinned in place. The reason I had to take this approach was because I needed to know where to sew the diagonal edges of the yoke over the tacked down pleats. I smoothed everything to keep the top edge of the petticoat level as I did this so that the front wouldn't end up shorter than the back. For the second half of the front, I had to be careful that I kept the point of the yoke exactly at the centre front, but this diagonal edge ended up a bit longer. Maybe I stretched it, or let's face it, I just wasn't very precise with my cutting, but I ended up being able to shrink the excess out with some steam and then ease in the fullness with lots of careful pinning. And then the prospect of trying to get this heavy, now very spiky seam through the sewing machine didn't feel like something I was down for, so I tacked it in place. It takes longer, but it's more secure and more likely to be a success the first time around, so it was worth it. At this point, this was all the white thread I had left, so I had to get this right. I was so glad I'd tacked this in place, it made everything so much simpler. I'm just top stitching the yoke on. I didn't use a top stitching foot because I find if I need to sew to the right of the guide, I can't really see what I'm doing, so I used my ordinary foot and just took things slow. I pivoted at the point at the front to get a nice finish. I know top stitching isn't accurate for this era, but if I was going to do it, I wanted it to be neat, especially at the front. I then very carefully trimmed away the excess fabric of the pleats that would sit inside the yoke. This was quite a heart-wrenching moment because having spent all that time ironing and tacking, if I had to redo it, I would have been mad. But I managed, it was fine. I could then fold the yoke lining into position, turning under the raw edge to match the sewing line and pinning it in position. This was one of those things, I probably should have gone back up to the ironing board and pressed everything to get it super smooth and accurate, but I didn't. I chose having wrinkles and being done sooner over a smooth finish on the inside because, well, it's the inside, no one's going to see it. It was a bit trickier to manage this around the curves of the back section, but with a bit more smoothing and patience I got there. As I was so short of thread at this point, that meant I couldn't do a sink stitch or a top stitch, I had to hand stitch. I didn't mind so much because, I mean, this is a historical project, Part of the appeal is hand sewing, and I'm also pretty quick at this sort of thing, so it was nice to end on something a bit more refined than just bashing these things together. I also removed as much of the gathering threads as I had the patience for before giving up where it was too tricky and decided to just come back to it when I had more time. And then finally, the petticoats were finished. All in all, I was able to make these petticoats over 3 days, which is pretty quick for me. I'm really pleased with how they turned out and the volume and the shape I was able to get without adding too much weight. You might notice I didn't add any fastenings. This was sort of deliberate. It was one of those, oh, I'll come back to it when I know more about how tight I want them to fit, but I just never did. I went to the ball with them just safety pinned shut, and that worked really well because it allowed me to decide how tight I wanted my corset on the day, and I knew everything would still fit. The bigger over petticoat is too short. Maybe one day I'll make it better by rehemming it or adding a ruffle or flounce, but it was fine for the ball. In fact, it probably stopped me tripping, so I called it good. If this reveal is a little manic in atmosphere, that was because I was really losing the will to live at this point and I still had 2 dresses to make. But it was finally time to get to work on the important bit, the ball gown. Thanks for watching. See you next time.